I'm not the biggest selfie taker, but admittedly, I have a few in the catalog near and dear to my heart. One, my favorite perhaps, taken when I'm 20, is me, head laid back on a twig-infested forest floor, eyes dazed, nostrils crusted, pupils dilated, wearing shitty $9.99 headphones, and best of all, resting on my forehead, a small blue agate slab, and balancing on that, a purple amethyst. The caption version has since been lost to the digital black hole, but I think it was something like, astral projection initiated, with a winky emoji at the end. I know, it's stupid, but memorable to me. I won't go into the details of my happy day in the woods, but I distinctly remember taking that photo because that period of my life is when basically all hippie, new agey concepts I had perhaps been considering conforming to were quickly thrown out the window and replaced with a hearty dose of cynicism directed at any talk of chakras, auras, or energies. The selfie is dorky and silly, but I still love it because it kind of captures a transitional chapter in my spiritual journey of life, if you will, because not long before that, I was actually very much interested in learning how to astral project. However, that desire was quickly replaced with a lack of attention relating to anything involved in the metaphysical. Growing up in Portland, I had been introduced to several forms of alternative healing and countercultural beliefs. But when I got to the University of Oregon my freshman year, it was like all those concepts had been condensed into one small campus-sized location, and everybody walking around had similar beliefs. It was too much for me, I think. It's sad and egotistical to admit, but the oversaturation of common beliefs is what I think ultimately gave me this snarky, rejected all outlook on these practices. The same as Catholic school did to me having any chance of living a religious life just a few years earlier. Today, I'd like to think I have a much softer approach to all forms of spirituality because, the whole, we're all just trying to get by and all that jazz. While I wouldn't say I adhere to any consistent practice involving religion, spirituality, or mysticism, I'm certainly intrigued by the ways and methods people turn to seek self-care and work on their well-being. To be honest, I haven't even ever done organized talk therapy, so I'm really the last person to judge any form people use to feel balanced in their day-to-day lives. Besides, like I said, I almost was a part of this intense growth of New Age and alternative healing practices. There was even a time, the pinnacle of my exploration into spirituality at this point, that I had meditation and yoga practices nurturing each specific chakra. Even came this close to purchasing crystals coordinating to each chakra to set up ceremoniously during meditations, stopping short only because I didn't have the money to buy them all at once and worried about the temporary imbalance it might cause. Of course, these habits were formed through the most obtuse University of YouTube education possible, my modern Western lens absorbing ancient lessons of the East in far too neat of a bow to actually result in abiding growth. Clearly, I had no true respect or understanding for what are in fact parts of long-term traditions, instead doling intricate and deep-rooted practices down to simplistic understandings consumable via a laptop, digitally hodgepodging together my very own How to Be Spiritual for Dummies manual. I'd like to say my curiosity came from an internal calling, but the reality is, sometime in the early 2010s, aka right when I started high school, things like singing bowls, incense sticks, and mandala tapestries began growing in popularity. This isn't the first time that products like these or the culture connected to them have crept into the American mainstream. However, now in 2021, I think it's pretty safe to say that this isn't a fad that's going anywhere anytime soon. And in this sort of all-encompassing New Age movement going on, there is a product used in spirituality that happens to be attached to an economically elastic, uniquely aesthetic industry that has trucked right through one of the most financially difficult years for both individuals and industries we've seen in quite some time. Crystals. These absolutely stunning fragments of the earth have never been more popular in the United States, and I guess the simple question is, why? To understand the crystal industry in the United States, you have to go back to the 1970s, when people started taking an interest in gemstones like quartz and rose quartz, both in the blossoming, hippie New Age community, but also, and more commonly at the time, among geode fanatics fascinated by the science behind the crystal formation process. Picture dads with mineralogy books and magnifying glasses. Think Hank from Breaking Bad and his whatever you do, don't call them rocks collection of various gemstones. The timing makes sense. The 60s and 70s were filled with some of the most environmentally charged movements the world had ever seen. Things like hiking and backpacking were growing in popularity as they became more financially and geographically accessible. It had been just over 100 years since the last Industrial Revolution, and people were reconnecting with the earth. Collecting crystals would have been one of the easiest ways to have a little piece of nature around all the time. I think the armchair scientist community had a heightened passion because, on a scientific level, they're really cool. Crystals, by definition, are solid materials whose constituents, meaning atoms, molecules, or ions, are arranged in an ordered and patterned fashion, such that the shape of the whole crystal will largely represent its atomic structure. While not all crystals are precious minerals, think back to maybe making salt or sugar crystals in science class, the crystals that are essentially really, really cool looking models of atomic structures, which is some real nerdy shit. American interest traces even further back, with something called the Tucson Gem and Mineral Festival first taking place in 1955. For the first couple of decades, the event attracted a couple thousand visitors at most. However, soon, the trend began trickling into more widespread popularity, with people purchasing crystals not for any scientific or spiritual significance, but simply because they looked pretty. The trend continued, with gemstones being the baby brother to the more expensive, lucrative diamond industry. But recently, a shift has occurred in the market as crystals rise in sales and the high-end diamond trade declines in profit. It seems that while many modern-day owners enjoy crystals simply for their aesthetic, a growing portion of the industry is dedicated to marketing the product for its supposed healing properties, as a large number of people turn to this form of alternative therapy. A quick Google search and you'll find Adele, Megan Fox, Victoria Beckham, multiple members of the Kardashian dynasty, and dozens more household names partake in crystal healing. I've only ever lived in Portland or Eugene, both of which frequently rank on lists like weirdest cities or hippie havens of the U.S., so I've grown up seeing uniquely decorated buildings, often featuring language and imagery of the quote-unquote Eastern world. But it's likely that today there are 4 more of these wherever you live than could be found, say, around the turn of the century. While the current and continuously growing crystal craze took off in the United States roughly 50 years ago, humanity's spiritual connection to gemstones traces back millennia. Excavation records show us that fragments of crystals, as well as imagery and literature about their powers, have been found across the world. The explanation for their near-universal adoration seems to have quite a simple answer. They're beautiful. Coming in just about every color imaginable, the way they reflect in certain light is truly enchanting. The word crystal comes from the ancient Greek word kristallos, literally meaning coldness or ice drawn together, reflecting the appearance of a large number of gemstones. In ancient Greek, the word amethyst translated to not intoxicate, with the belief that possession of an amethyst could help avoid hangovers or over-inebriation. In ancient Egypt, it is believed amulets made of carnelian and jasper were thought to keep away evil spirits, while also being worn to express social class. Fragments of crystals have also been found in the innermost areas of certain tombs, indicating their significant spiritual presence, while also suggesting some felt they would be taking these crystals to the next life. In the Western Hemisphere, crystal artifacts have been discovered way up in modern-day Canada, all the way down to what is now the south of Chile. While the Amazonian crystal skulls that have been mythologized in literature, film, and even now video games are completely a fictional creation, the Americas were a home to many communities that did in fact revere crystals. Throughout Mesoamerica, archaeologists have come upon both carved and uncut crystals throughout the former Mayan civilization, with a large number found in caves, suggesting that Mayans had a somewhat scientifically accurate relationship with crystals, storing them in what is often their natural birthing place. Considering the well-documented reverence Mayans held for the earth as an element, and the numerous gemstone-inspired altars and imagery found in the area, it's safe to say they held an esteemed respect for crystals. This respect and adoration continues throughout history. Flash forward after the creation of Christianity and Islam, and a deep reverence can be found in both of these newer religions. In Christianity, especially during the Middle Ages, crystals were used to decorate holy items in the clergy, with the belief that certain crystals manifested transcendence and possessed the light of the heavens. In Islam, most followers believe the Prophet Muhammad wore at least one ring decorated with a gemstone. While the type of material, the hand, and the finger he wore it on are frequently debated, it is near universally believed he did in fact have one, with the stone thought to be a type of akik or agate in English. This belief has transferred to modern times where in the Muslim community, rings are often decorated in agate, turquoise, ruby, jade, or emerald, all gemstones said to possess healing and guardian-like qualities in early Muslim texts. Like all religions, the level of devotion and belief to crystals varies. Regardless, it is the largest religion in the world to adhere to crystal-based traditions in the modern day. So, while there are hundreds of millions in the world who use specific minerals for direct religious practices, in places like the United States, the current industry seems to come out of this hybrid pocket somewhere between the deep devoted believer and the more loosely practicing individual. It seems to be a range, some may create entire crystal altars, similar to some that we've seen in specific artifacts, while others may just stick to wearing a necklace or a ring or two. In the current wave of American fascination, there does not seem to be one particular religion or culture of origin. Rather, components of several belief systems seem to have mixed, which is why in gem shops, you'll see crystals sacred to cultures all over the world, ones that would never be found near each other or in the same region, yet are all advertised under the same energy-possessing qualities. Of course, crystal healers tend to specialize in certain techniques or traditions, but there doesn't seem to be any hardline sects developing to separate varying healing practices. Now, is there actual proof that crystals possess healing qualities? Well, it sort of depends on who you ask. But in short, the scientific community says no, while the dedicated healers say yes. As I said before, I do not partake in crystal healing. However, I know many do find it to be an extremely spiritual and useful part of their lives, so I'm not trying to negate any practicers, nor am I trying to do the opposite and disregard the current scientific consensus. I just think it's useful to see the range in beliefs regarding the power of crystals. Breaking down the concepts involved in modern American crystal healing is tricky because, as I mentioned before, they do not come from a singular place of origin. It's not an indoctrinated religion, so there's no one source I can pull from and neatly list some universal set of beliefs. So, in lieu, here's my attempt at explaining the main components of current American crystal healing based on the numerous articles, crystal healers' websites, YouTube channels, and more I looked up to find common themes as best as I could. Energy and vibration seem to be at the root of modern American crystal healing. In short, the human body, and this is not any sort of controversial idea, rather a scientific fact, contains energy. We run on chemical energy. Shout out to our adenosine triphosphate phosphocreatine system. I barely passed high school chemistry, so I'm not going to go into further scientific detail in this subject, but I just want to make this distinction that, yes, obviously humans using and running on chemical energy is a scientifically proven process, but it is not what individuals are referring to when they talk about energy in regards to healing and spirituality. This energy relates more to the, again, scientifically proven vibrations that occur in our body. As is a fairly common knowledge, nothing living or inanimate is ever truly static, meaning everything vibrates, down to the cell. In the practice of crystal healing and many other forms of alternative therapy, it is believed that these vibrations occur at varying frequencies depending on overall physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. The goal of crystal healing is to either maintain or return one's body to healthy levels, often described as raising your vibration frequency. Each type of crystal is believed to possess specific qualities, so practitioners will choose which ones to use based on their current needs. As I mentioned before, there are varying degrees of therapy, so some may just wear a ring or necklace to have gemstones close to them throughout the day, while others meditate in front of a crystal altar, and others will even actually go and seek a trained crystal healer and undergo therapy sessions under their guidance, an experience which often results in having gemstones placed throughout the body, on the forehead, the face, the chest, in one's hands, wherever they feel the crystal helps them most. Again, because I don't partake and because of the varying degrees at which people do, this is obviously far from a fully fleshed explanation. One thing I do want to point out, though, is in basically all the sources I used for researching this type of healing is that people were clear to state that this therapy requires work. I never found anywhere suggesting that, you just tape an amethyst to your head and all your problems will wash away. One source described crystals as amplifying intention, which I thought was a great way to explain the process. In crystal healing, while the crystals are there to support, it is equally as crucial that the individual is set on healing as well. I think one of the reasons people brush off a lot of forms of alternative therapy is because it can seem like people are claiming to have oversimplified solutions to complex problems. If someone who thinks the idea of crystal healing is absolutely idiotic, a therapy session would do nothing. You could literally dump a pile of crystals on them and they would feel no spiritual change. That said, another reason crystal healing remains an alternative therapy is because, by definition, it is classified as a pseudoscience. I know that word can be extremely frustrating to people, so I just want to be clear that I mean that in the most clinical sense, simply saying that the scientific community has yet to be able to prove with evidence that crystals possess any healing properties. While a scientist may argue that a precious gemstone itself is not doing anything to help heal someone, I think many would still suggest that the process can produce positive results through the placebo effect. After all, placebos are widely used in both scientific research and in medicine. A 2008 study published by the British Medical Journal questioned 679 physicians and found that 46 to 58% of those doctors used placebos with their patients. This wide percentage range comes from the fact that doctors answered differently depending on how the question was phrased and also to the degree of which they implement placebos. Because while they are used regularly, placebos are still somewhat controversial, as some argue it deceives the patient and takes away their autonomy. If a patient is prescribed a vitamin or nasal spray that in essence doesn't do much physically, but based on studies, has the high potential to better the patient's life just by thinking the remedy is curing them, is it wrong? While some say yes, advocates, and this comes directly from the study, quote, advocates of placebo treatments argue that promoting the placebo effect might be one of the most effective treatments available for many chronic conditions and can be accomplished without deception, end quote. Even if a doctor wouldn't prescribe a placebo, I think they would basically all be on the same page about the fact that placebos can still improve someone's life. From their perspective, meaning a traditional scientific approach, I think they would say that people who believe in crystals and their healing properties will experience a positive reaction when they go through the practice. However, the result would be through the ritual itself and the individual's intention behind the action, creating an uplifting change in the mind. This positive reaction is broken up into two experiences. Feeling better when your emotions are improved and you can sense it happening, and then one step further to objective change, where there is actual, detectable biological change in your body. While we are still learning more and more about placebos, it seems your environment, biology, and trauma, among other factors, can affect how inclined your brain is to the placebo effect. In essence, it seems, at least to me, at the end of the day, placebo or not, if something like crystal healing improves your life, is there really a difference? Humans are complex and creative. We all have things that make us feel good and feel bad, things to alter our emotions. I mean, I devote so much time and emotional energy to millionaires playing sports on TV who happen to play for the city I'm from. I religiously listen to certain comedy podcasts for weekly audio euphoria. I'm not trying to reduce forms of healing or therapy to me watching sport ball or listening to my shows. I'm just saying that we all have things we do and enjoy that, if you break down, could seem pretty irrational to someone else. One of my favorite, most wholesome, earnest examples of this way humans will have different responses to certain ideas, beliefs, and objects, specifically regarding the world of alternative healing, was a few years back. I was working security at a hippie festival of sorts, a pretty relaxed gig. We were all just hanging out, checking wristbands. One of the other guards has sage lit, just waving it around, kind of doing her thing. And this being the kind of community it is, many people start coming up to her pretty quickly. They close their eyes, they stretch their arms out. Some will ask for a blessing, and she'd go about and wave the stick around their torso, up to their face, sometimes do a full 360 around them if she was feeling extra generous. And eventually, towards the end of the day, after blessing number 86, she just leans over to me and goes, "I don't know anything about any kind of blessing. I just like the way it smells." We are still learning more about the placebo effect, and I should note, the placebo effect is an umbrella term. As I mentioned before, placebos can affect individuals to varying degrees, so it's not like these terms mean one specific process going on in our brains. As we begin to learn more and more about the placebo effect, I'm curious to see how it will alter people's opinions regarding non-scientifically proven practices or ideas. Because the more we learn about how powerful our minds are and the realities our neurons can spin for us, perhaps we can fine-tune the ways placebos affect us for the better. If you believe crystals genuinely possess healing qualities beyond humans using the placebo effect, I certainly will never call you flat out wrong. I'm not a scientist, and quite frankly, I'm about as far from it as it comes, so I won't pretend to have the answers or make any definitive statements about the validity of crystals' powers. What I will say is, whether you believe wholeheartedly in the power of crystals, or if you even refuse to be friends with someone who owns a turquoise ring, one thing is undeniable. Crystals can do some pretty cool shit. Certain crystals can produce what is called piezoelectric charge. Piezoelectricity, in short, is an electric charge that occurs in certain solid materials in response to mechanical stress. This was first discovered in the 19th century using quartz, because while all crystals have unit cells, not all are symmetrical. Quartz happens to be one of these. Its cell structure is elongated and not perfectly cube-like. Made of oxygen and silicon, the oxygen produces a slight positive charge, while the silicon produces a slight negative charge, creating a separation known as a dipole between each bond. In a normal setting, these charges are cancelled out and nothing happens. However, if you squeeze or apply enough pressure to quartz, it stretches and smushes the dipoles, creating an asymmetrical charge. Because they no longer cancel each other out, one face of the crystal produces a positive charge, while the other a negative, creating a voltage that can drive electricity through a circuit. This was first used in France in World War I submarine sonar instruments. By placing a piezoelectric quartz crystal in the transmitter and subjecting it to alternating voltages, the electric charge that would be produced would send ultrasound waves through the water, which, when measuring the time it took for them to bounce back, determined the distance of large, below-sea objects, marking potential targets and threats. Piezoelectricity has since developed and is now used in everyday products like printers, medical imaging machines, watches, certain barbecue lighters, even those birthday cards that sing to you. While much of this now runs on synthetic crystalline materials, without natural crystals, none of this would be possible. They really are undeniably extraordinary. While they weren't implemented into modern science until just over a century ago, I think humanity has understood its significance in them for a long time. Which is why I think it's impossible to disregard the ways they positively affect people as nonsense or worthless. Regardless of spiritual belief, we all use necklaces, statues, posters, clothing, tokens that have deeper meaning than meets the eye. Further, if crystal therapy is a form of placebo, well, studies have shown that the same effect can be found in patients of certain acupuncture and chiropractic facilities. So, if it's making people feel better, so long as it doesn't replace necessary medical treatment or take advantage of people financially, which I suppose is a weighted concept, but still, if neither of those things are occurring, is it worth shitting on or trying to delegitimize? I don't know. One thing is for sure, though. If minerals as a whole remain popular and in high demand, there are some issues that will continue to take place. For starters, costs will continue to increase, with some already pricing out the average buyer. At the Tucson Gem and Mineral Showcase, which started with just a couple thousand people, now sees roughly $5 billion in crystal transactions over the course of 3 weeks, with some individual gemstones going for millions. Crystals, which in, say, 2005, 2010, would have been fairly affordable, have increased 10-fold in price. And that's the thing. Minerals don't have some consistent basis at which it's understood they should cost. It's such a subjective market that, depending on the buyer and seller, the exact same piece could go for vastly different prices. I've experienced it firsthand. For the longest time, my girlfriend had a mixing bowl-sized amethyst slab. Neither her roommates, or I were practitioners of any kind of crystal therapy, so the thing just kind of lived with us, often serving as a doorstop or, and I know this is terrible, an ashtray/jewel pot graveyard. Because no one was giving it the love it could be receiving, she sold it. I won't say for how much, but I can guarantee she gave a great deal and could have charged much, much more, especially in a place like the Pacific Northwest. The intense interest has also led to the frequent selling of fake gemstones, often made of glass or even plastic, both online and in stores. I suppose someone who argues the placebo effect would say there's no difference, but I hated getting duped when it even came to fake Yu-Gi-Oh cards, so I get it. The more sinister and truly tragic aspect of the industry comes from the cultivation process itself. While there are ethically sourced crystals where employees are paid well and the production leaves a zero carbon footprint, a great deal are sourced without much regulation in regard to the working conditions or the environmental impact. In places like Madagascar, where they mine rose quartz, clear quartz, purple amethyst, everything except sapphires and rubies, a mayor of a mining town once said, the working conditions result in annual deaths, certain locations risk landslide, and the dust produced by the smashing of rocks and crystals can get deep into the lungs, increasing the risk of cancer and silicosis. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, children as young as 7 often work in the mines, extracting minerals like cobalt and smoky quartz from some of the world's largest clusters of these gemstones. In 2016, a study by Global Witness found that in Afghanistan, where large amounts of lapis, a crystal believed to contain healing powers, are naturally found, the Taliban had all but monopolized the local industry, making upwards of $20 million annually for having control of the Afghani mining operations. In some situations, crystals aren't even the main reason people are mining. Rather, people are extracting other resources, and crystals become a byproduct, an extra source of revenue if you're in charge of these mines. And let's be clear, the biggest buyers, and often the biggest profiters, as is the case with oil and drugs, are Americans, once again leading the pack. Realistically, the Earth cannot handle the current rate of crystal extraction forever. As places like the United States and Europe continue to become bigger and bigger markets for the crystal industry, more and more land in, and I'm not a huge fan of this term, but developing nations will have to be exploited further, both in the lives of those working in the mines as well as the effect on the land that mining produces. Mining any kind of natural resource is inherently invasive to the earth, which is why people like Richard Wegner of Wegner Quartz Crystal Mines, a zero carbon footprint, so-called green crystal mining facility based out of Arkansas, believe it is important to take cautionary measures when extracting natural resources. Otherwise, as he puts it, mining becomes a wound in the earth. Look, so many of our clothes, electronics, household products, etc., are produced through methods I think most would find absolutely abhorrent. Crystal production is not uniquely exploitative. However, if people are buying them because they feel they possess healing qualities, how healing is a crystal that was mined by a young child who now has breathing problems and has never been properly compensated for their labor? Because, after all, there are ways to find ethically sourced crystals, as I mentioned before. There's even places like the Salt Plains National Wildlife Refuge, an 11,000-acre natural landscape where, for certain parts of every year, they encourage people to come dig for selenite crystals. While these are a specific and fairly common gemstone, the naturally forming hourglass shapes they come in are unique to the salt flats. The reason behind this seemingly flip-flopped policy is the digging actually creates holes and pockets which birds like snowy plovers and interior least terns use for protection from the wind as they lay their eggs. This is obviously a very specific location and doesn't even put a drop in the bucket of the crystal industry, so it's far from an overall solution. I just think most humans have some sort of trinket or token that means something special to them, and I just feel a greater awareness of how those special items end up in our hands is a good thing. In no way did I want to put the crystal industry or crystal healers on trial through this episode. I just wanted to take an in-depth look at a growing practice that seems to be entering the zeitgeist more and more. At the start, I mentioned I almost took a path of enriching my life with alternative healing, and while I didn't and don't adhere to any beliefs, I'll say this. When I was doing my sort of mystical thing, saying different chants when I meditated based on which chakra I was focusing my attention on, my meditations and mental well-being were actually some of the best they've ever been. I felt good. I won't say it's the happiest I've ever been or anything like that, but there's certainly several components, the meditation and the yoga and the overall care for my body, that I have struggled to work on since leaving those behind. I, for one, am excited to see the way placebo research expands, hopefully leading us to growing practices that, through healthily tricking our mind, can improve our overall well-being. I'm not so excited about the progression of the crystal industry, not because of crystals themselves, but because, as with any product boom, we've seen the negative ramifications. Enhancing regulations on mining internationally will take time and effort, and at this point, there's little to suggest it is a widespread priority. Perhaps, though, if enough awareness is spread within the subculture of gemstone and mineral collectors and aficionados, consumers can begin to more widely seek out ethically sourced products across the industry as a whole.